what that has been like and lessons learned and things that you notice with the population that you are working with?
No day is the same. Dealing with teens, you have your good days, bad days. They have their own individual stressors of what they deal with and how they manage. So you have to take each day in each situation and tackle its own challenges and provide them the tools that they need.
You're 100% correct. Do you think that the teams that you've do you think the teams feel pretty comfortable?
Some of them, yes, some of them it takes a minute for them to find their footing to be comfortable enough to speak in an open setting, whether it's groups or individual.
Yeah, no two human beings are the same, whether they are teenagers or they are adults, but trying to, I like to say, meet people where they're at, it often opens doors and increase opportunities for conversation. If they are a little withdrawn, then that's okay, but it should, always be a priority to try to see if there's anything that can be said to cause them to smile or anything, things like that. So have you ever had experiences like that, not just in this situation, but just in life, period?
Yes.
Okay. Can you give me an example of a time where somebody was in a funk and you used your personality to help bring them out of it?
Typically, a good icebreaker is music, food, something you try to find something that brings people together, commonality, or for them to share a good memory.
Yeah. I enjoy food. I think most people do, and that's a easy, common conversation to have, like favorite restaurant. Like for example, what's your favorite restaurant?
I like a lot Italian food. I like going to Maggiano's.
Italian food and Maggiano. Okay, and it's just that simple in terms of just engaging and figuring out. And I noticed when you mentioned that you even had a smile. So it's those little things, paying attention to the whole person as they are talking. And so speaking of talking, I think it's more important for your voice to be heard than my voice. And of course, I'm here to answer questions or add insight where necessary.
Do you have any recommendations on how to get teenagers to open up more?
I would say, going back to what I said a few moments ago, meet them where they're at without surrendering the power dynamic as an adult, um, because that could be a slippery slope um, when a parent or an adult tries to relate too much to um, the child in the generation that they're at. And the moment that, for example, a common term that's used these days is bruh. So if an adult, in my opinion, allows that young person to start referring to them as bruh, this or bruh that, then the power dynamic changes. Excuse me. So, did that answer the question for you?
Yes.
Okay. Um, Anything else that you can think of that may be a pressing concern that you may have when it, pertains to counseling, human behavior, or
What do you think is the impact from um, COVID to this generation of teenagers and the psychological impacts, and how do you handle those challenges?
I think that Um, First thing I would say is teenagers are very resilient. So a person that's currently 16 years old in 2025, in 2022, that person was already over the age of 12. So for that group, I think that they learned how to navigate and in some ways be much better because they didn't have the opportunity to have traditional connections with other kids. So, of course, with social media, that worked out great for some of them. Now, kids that were a little younger, it could have presented some challenges. Of course, if a child was on the spectrum, where facial expressions and being able to connect with people and see them, that certainly was problematic for that group of kids in comparison to others.
You mentioned social media.
Mhm.
How do you, or what's your recommendation when it comes to cyberbullying and social media playing such a huge role in how they interact with one another without the physical aspect of it?
So since in this capacity we don't give advice, what I would say is what I would do if it was me as a parent, guardian, or just someone that's deeply involved in the life of a young person. I would monitor what the child has access to see, as well as just making it a priority that there are start time and stop times on phone and tablet uses. And not only that too, I think the internet, because you don't necessarily have to have a phone these days. Springtime, thank you for that. In order for some of the kids to feel bullied. And one of the misconceptions is that they can just simply turn it off. But that's their norm to have these phones they've had in their whole lives. So I think it would be best served if parents and guardians had honest conversations and teach their kids how to navigate around the use of the phone to prevent themselves from being bullied.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely welcome. So how do you believe that you're doing? How do you think that you've been doing as a supervisee to this point?
I think it's been a roller coaster ride, good and bad. You have days where there's full engagement. You have days where you're not sure if the message came across. You have days where you question the influence and impact of the tools that you provided them, if they've resonated, and the effectiveness once they leave.
Yeah. And of course, in this particular capacity, for the purpose of this course, it's, it can't be easy for yourself, someone who's not who doesn't have a background as a counselor or counseling student, to become familiar with some of the terminology, as well as learning how to navigate these conversations. So in an ideal situation, I would have been doing these exercises, these recordings with fellow counseling students, doctoral students who are more familiar. And so certainly want to give you grace, as well as acknowledge that you've been a trooper in this process of sitting down and having these conversations and trying to navigate your way through the lingo Um, because I would imagine that if I had to do it in somebody else's lane of expertise, that it would probably be difficult, right?
Yes.
So, but you yourself, you've embraced it, and I want you to know I appreciate that.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Yeah. So, what do you think makes a counselor proficient, as well as what qualities do you think that an individual should possess on top of knowledge base?
Besides the academic that you mentioned, experience, having the hands-on of being in the field, having the practicum that is required to be in the lane that they're going to be serving, whether it's the adult arena, whether it's adolescent, whether it's children, whether is the, I don't know if the correct term is mentally insane, whatever aspect of the mental health or mental illness side of it that it pertains to, whether it's addiction, abuse, whatever side of it is, that they actually have the experience to speak to it, and it's not just book knowledge.
You know, that certainly makes a difference, and that's where theory and practice comes into place, right? Because you made mention of the academic or book knowledge. That's all theory, but being able to sit down like this, you put it into practice. You're, because what we're doing, we're demonstrating the competence and proficiency that's required to be effective in these roles, as well as being familiar with the terminology. I think you used a few moments ago, mentally insane.
Yes.
And that certainly is not a term that we would refer to, saying someone is mentally insane. Not in 2025, you know, decades ago. So you rarely hear that a person is insane, because one of the shifts have been to try to change the culture of how people speak about mental health and mental illness and just really emotional well-being. Because if somebody believes that they are insane, or they then that's viewed as, you know, an attack, right? So those are those little nuances that I think that you just spoke to, that does make a difference. And there's so many different forms of counseling, to where it'll take me at least 5 minutes to go through all the different disciplines that are now out there. But what's important to know is that when you are in a human services field, an industry, you certainly have to be passionate about the people that you're going to potentially serve. So what ethical boundaries or issues do you think that can present themselves in a field like this?
I mean, I think ethically, a counselor should not be divulging information about their client. There should definitely be lines drawn in the sand when it comes to professionally between the person you see and the client. There should not be any mixture of those boundaries. between the professional and the client. There should just not be nothing inappropriate that happens that could misconstrue the lines of getting the help you need, because that there's already a stigma when it comes to mental health.
You're certainly correct. And now, one thing that's misconstrued in counseling, it's okay and it's appropriate to do self disclosures for the purpose of, like an example, earlier, you made mention of Margianos, right? And in food. And I said, hey, we all like to eat, we all like food. So that's a touch and go. And that's with the intended purpose of keeping the conversation going so that you're relatable to that client, but you're correct in the sense that that client, if they have a dog and they're talking to you about their dog, and you say, oh yeah, I also have a dog too, those things are appropriate. But if they're talking about financial hardships that they're having, problems in their marriage and things like that, absolutely, that's a no-go. There should be no reason to share that type of information with a client that you're seeing, as well as I've always had anti-hugging and touching policies with clients. So, like, the moment I meet them, I shake their hand, coming and going. But beyond that, there's no additional touching. Those are boundaries, professional boundaries that have always kept me in the right place. Because there are some counselors who hug their clients. But to me, that's always been a no-go. So there are codes of ethics that are involved with this, things that we're governed by. And the most important one is do no harm. So when you hear do no harm to a client, whether that person is a believer or not a believer, what comes to your mind?
I would believe that you would mean to do no harm physically, mentally, emotionally to the person, to not create or make the situation worse than what that person is already experiencing.
Yeah. That is right, 100% accurate. So an example of that would be a person comes in and they have a history of trauma, and as the counselor, you believe it'll be beneficial for them to go ahead and open up and discuss whatever it is, but by pushing that person, do you think that that would help that person or hinder them in their healing process?
I think it all depends on the situation. You never want to open up Pandora's box without equipping them with the tools to be able to brace for that. It's no different than the saying right time, right place. Timing is everything, and it all depends on how much time you have in the session. You don't want to wait till the last minute of the session to open up something, and then that person has to leave and unpack those feelings wherever they're at and deal with it until the next session. That's not fair to them.
So
and it can be volatile for them, and it can set them off.
So I agree with you 100% on that. We should not open any doors that we're not prepared to help them close in a reasonable amount of time, right? Because what we discuss with clients have the potential to have residual feelings and thoughts afterwards. And so I've always viewed it as irresponsible to one push, because your response was it depends. Well, it really depends on that client's comfort level, because even though you may think that it'd be beneficial for them to go ahead and discuss whatever it is, for them it may still be something that they prefer to close guard, and to their own detriment at times. But it's about when they feel comfortable, because all of this is client centered, not our curiosity to find out what's going on and get them to open up about it. Because at that point, we have to look at ourselves and question: is this for the benefit of the client, or is this for my benefit? And it should never be about us.
Counseling should never be or shouldn't be viewed or treated as a one-stop shop approach where whatever you did for one is the cookie cutting, or the design pattern that you use for everybody else, because it all is predicated on the individual.
Correct, correct. And there's so many different counseling modalities and techniques that can be applied. And one of the things that some counselors don't feel comfortable with is discussing faith with their clients. That's never been an issue for me. But what's your position in terms of if a client is and you know that they're a Christian and they are dealing with different life challenges, would you find it to be appropriate to speak to them about faith, or would you leave that completely out of the conversation?
I think you have to know the person you're dealing with. If you don't assess it properly, it can go wrong. Having the wrong conversation at the wrong time with the wrong person can be detrimental.
I like that, and I agree with it. So sometimes there are spiritual questionnaires, like to just see what's a person's sense of hope, what gives them purpose. Do they what's their higher power? What and it's all centered to check the temperature, because there's so many elements of spirituality outside of just the traditional religion, that like meditation, guided meditation and things like that. There's even yoga that can be implemented. That can be implemented. So, what are your thoughts on any of those things?
I think it's all predicated on right time, right place. And it all is based on the individual's transparency and honesty. Because when you first meet somebody, they're a stranger. You're a stranger to them. So how do you know if they are being honest when they're filling out the questionnaire, and you're not meeting their representative, and they're giving you the appropriate political answer just to meet that wicket on that questionnaire?
Yeah. I mean,
but that comes with time.
Correct. It's about establishing a rapport, right?
Yes.
Because typically clients are never going to come in the door on day one just ready to let all their guards down, even though we give them a safe place and take a non-biased approach, non-judgmental. They still are introducing themselves to strangers, and they're not going to, or rarely, shall I say, are they going to just lay everything out on the floor, and they take some probing to figure out who they are and what their issues really are, and whether or not you're going to be an appropriate fit for them. So, can you think of what may prevent a counselor from being an appropriate fit for someone?
I think perception is everything. First impressions are everything. So something that can prevent someone from being a good fit to a client, it could be the way they're dressed, how they speak, how they carry themselves, what the counseling environment looks like, what it smells like. Um, Anything can be a trigger to the client.
Yeah.
So just being conscious of that. One thing for sure is if you think about it, when you go to a spa is a relaxing setting. So from the lighting to the music to the smell, it's already sets the tone for a comfortable, relaxing environment. So if you put it in proper perspective, if you take the same tools that they use, it can help when you're setting the tone for counseling.
Yeah. And you said something because if a odor is overwhelming or too strong, and that person has a sensitive nose, for example, that may make it uncomfortable for a person to sit in a room with someone with heavy cologne or perfume on. So that's a really great point that you raise, as well as there's so many different small things um, that can alter whether or not a person believes someone is an appropriate fit for them. Being insensitive about something that they um, bring up, even though there may still be a level of respect there, empathy is key. But
Or
respect.
I'm sorry, I don't mean to cut you off. Or being a counselor that doesn't, you know, doesn't have a poker face, for lack of a better term. That you wear your feelings and you react to a client's um, moment of vulnerability when they're sharing.
Yeah. You're you're really accurate with that. And this is why it's important to have good supervision, because that clinical supervisor should be there to mentor and make sure that areas where that counselor needs to be stronger, that they can hold them accountable, hold him or her accountable, and give them some pointers on how to navigate around situations like that in the future. So supervision is the one thing that I don't think that most counselors can truly get enough of. And going back to when I was doing my practicum, um, one thing that was always made mention of: seek supervision. Anytime you feel uncomfortable, anytime you feel stuck, the best thing to do is to seek supervision, because none of us have it all figured out. And I don't think, no matter how many years you are in human services, behavior health, psychology, that things are, they just don't stay the same. Terminology changes, personnel changes, um, modalities and beliefs also. So it's like, hey, you have to eventually seek supervision to the clarity you need. So does that make sense to you?
Yes.
Okay. Um, so in a supervisee supervisor setting, who do you believe holds the power?
I think the supervisor's there to assess and, for lack of a better term, to be a fly on the wall and to mentor the the
Supervisee.
supervise supervisee is the one that holds the power.
Actually, that's not accurate.
Hold on. I may have mixed that up.
It's okay. It's sort
So,
yeah.
can you clear that up for me? The supervisor is the one supervising
Yes,
the supervisee?
yes,
Okay. So the supervisor is the one that holds the power.
correct. And that's why it's so important that that's a person of integrity and they don't take advantage of their position, because that supervisee is expecting that mentorship, that guidance that we spoke about, and they're relying on the years of wisdom that the supervisor have to help them when they find themselves stuck. That's why it's called seek supervision.
Have you ever experienced someone in the role of supervisor that doesn't meet the criteria of being in that role with experience level or exposure to be in that role?
So different agencies have different needs and even some different challenges. What I would say though is competency matters. The ability to understand what that job scope is, as well as operating within your lane. That's huge in this industry. You hear someone say stay in your lane. Well, in therapy, that's exactly what's necessary, so there's no overlapping. For example, and this kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier, but I didn't want to use a lot of time to explain it. So social workers, counselors, mental health, LMACs, licensed mental health counselors, psychologists, behavior analysts, all the different support, LPCs, Christian counselors, and there's so many different forms of counselors and therapists, licensed marriage and family therapists, that in these days, there's a lot of overlapping where people from the disciplines are trying to do the same thing, but what we're all governed by is our individual discipline. They all have different regulation boards, and we're supposed to operate within our scope of competency in our practice without trying to pretend that we're doing this or we're doing that. So an example, a Psych D and a PhD in psychology are two different things as well, but a lot of times the general public doesn't know that. So hope that answers your question, and I didn't go on a tangent too much, but trying to simplify why it's critical to operate within those lanes. Did that make sense to you?
Sure.
No, if it didn't, it's okay, because that's a lot of different acronyms that I gave you.
So you're right, there were a lot of acronyms, and for a normal person that is seeking help, may not be able to distinguish between the lanes.
Correct.
And knowing that if someone is looking for help, I just need help, not knowing the differences between the lanes is super imperative to understand where to look.
Yeah.
But not knowing the difference in the lanes, that's why I was asking, have you ever experienced that someone in a lane not being qualified for that role, and in a supervisor lane where they're overseeing someone else or supposed to be mentoring someone else? For example, life coaches. I know everyone in this world has seen Iyana was a TV show as a life coach. The normal public would not understand, that there's a difference in the lanes. They just see it as, this is a form of therapy of someone having issues and this is Elaine. But there's no supervisor. You would think that that is a supervisor and someone talking you through the process. What would you say is the major difference in what you see on TV and what you explain as a supervisor and supervisee?
I would certainly, thank you for that question. I would certainly make it clear that a life coach, um, they do serve they do have a space, but they should not be mistaken or compared to graduate level um, counselors, like individuals who, the whether it's a social worker or LMHC, all of these individuals have gone to school and they've obtained the minimum of a master's degree, whether they're going through the licensing process or not. Um, but they at least have the education. Where a life coach, to your point, anyone can be considered a life coach, and there's no regulatory board that oversees it.
So there was no supervision to that process?
No.
Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, there's no state oversight for life coaches. In fact, you can be a life coach after we conclude this session if you chose to. And I don't say that to make a mockery, but just to bring awareness. Then there are some international coaching ICB. I think I don't want to mess it up, but there's a few different life coaching organizations that have emerged, but there's still no state oversight over that.
So are those like certificate programs?
They are certificate programs created by the Federation of Life Coaches, for example.
Okay.
So, if that makes sense. But here's something important to note also. There are licensed social workers, there are licensed counselors and psychologists who are also life coaches.
Okay.
The credibility matters because even though they may be one part of their practice, or how they're utilizing their skills is for coaching, at least they have that formal education to support some of the therapeutic elements that they may incorporate.
How does someone who doesn't have any background in this is able to distinguish by what number session would you say that someone should be able to distinguish whether it's a good fit, or has that person that they're seeing received enough training of either mentorship from a supervisor that makes them equipped to be able to be in that role, to receive what they need from that counselor?
Are you referring to the counselor or the counselee? Meaning, I'm sorry.
Let's say I go get services from a counselor.
Mm-hmm.
How would I know that that person is a good fit for me, that has been equipped with the training by a supervisor and has enough time underneath their belt to equip me with what I need?
That's a very difficult question to answer for me, because it really depends on that individual that's seeking services and for what they're trying to be seen for. It's hard to gauge and put a hard line there, because it could be just a matter of personality differences, or it just could not be a good fit in the sense that, hey, I specialize in trauma, which I do, and you're seeking someone because you have relationship issues. That's not going to be a great match. If I'm trauma focus centered, and you, even though the breakup of the relationship could have been traumatic, most of the attention and time would probably be spent um, trying to help with closure from the relationship or figure out what's next. And if there's a partner involved, whether there needs to be couple sessions, so that wouldn't be a good fit, if that makes sense to you. Because we all have different lanes and specialties. So I would say, even for myself, I'm trying to ensure that the person that's sitting before me, that I'm able to help them, because it's not about just having a client, it's having clients who can benefit from my services and my skill set.
Okay.
And so as a counselor, that should matter as well, because if you fail to connect to the people that you are serving, then you're ultimately going to do them a disservice. It's just like watching the clock. So does that make sense to you?
Yes.
Okay. So what I will say as we prepare to conclude this is that the the supervisor, the supervisee role is unique, and it's something that's built over time. But the idea is to help that person, that counselee or supervisee, to grow in their role, become more comfortable in their role, become more competent, as well as it's both parties can learn from each other. So I don't think it has to be one dimensional.
Is there a minimum set of time that is established before someone is signed off?
Well, thank you for that question. It depends on the agency. Um, but typically what you're going to see is for the first 6 months to a year, where the clinical supervisor is going to, for a new counselor, but also in the role of a clinical supervisor, this doesn't just pertain to new counselors. If you're a clinical supervisor, you're responsible for the training, as well as signing off on clinical documentation, and oversight of those clinical operations for the people that you are over, whether they are licensed or not. So, and that's one of the major differences between someone that's a counselor, or let's just say therapist, and a clinical supervisor. Clinical supervisor normally has a high level of understanding, their competency part, experience, in leadership, clinical leadership, than a person who just may have their LCSW, for example. So, but it's an ongoing relationship. It's not like, okay, you've been here for a few months and I think you got everything, you can never take your hands off. Now the difference is, and it's important for me to note this, is that if you have a person that is proficient, you're not going to need to provide them as much supervision as you would someone that you're having problems with getting their documentation complete on time, whether it's their clinical notes or billable hours or low, and things of that nature.
And then the supervisory role, I'm assuming, is watching the interaction one-on-one, is watching the charting that happens behind the scenes, is watching what else am I missing?
So the supervisor isn't necessarily watching, because you're not a part of those sessions, right? But however, you are monitoring progress, and you're also taking complaints. If that client says that this individual has said or done something, then it's that supervisor's responsibility to intervene as well as try to figure out whether or not that particular client in that caseload needs to be transferred to someone else who may be better equipped to work with that person. So there are other layers to it than that. But I've never been in an actual session with a counselor or therapist and their client because it's about the confidentiality and that rapport that they built. And if you introduce someone else to it, then that can make that client uncomfortable.
So does that assessment come just from reading notes?
Yes. So you can, doing this for a while, you can pick up on the way that they chart their notes, and you're also looking for whether or not there are gaps in their progress notes or their assessments. Did they give the person the appropriate diagnosis? Is this a thorough treatment plan? So there are things that you can identify whether or not that person needs some additional training.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you so much for taking the time to sit down and do this yet again. I know we've done this a few different times, and you've always been so gracious to assist with it. So, anything else before